think cities and stakeholders really are starting to understand the very significant benefits of densification in urban cores. It breeds and fosters a mindset of working towards mixed use, stackable uses, and trying to mix living and working in the same environment along with entertainment. And I think over the next 10 years, cities and other stakeholders are going to come together in a much more significant way. They already have in Toronto, but in some of the other larger urban centers, and really work together to try to create some of that critical mass and densification.
Well, I think we can't ignore the trend of migration into the city cores. We see it especially in the high growth markets across the country. I think that's going to continue. You know, there's a war of talent going on right now, so companies are attracting, especially millennials who want to work, live, and play experience. So we see a lot of this migration coming into the city. I think what's going to happen, though, is that the definition of a core business district is going to change. There's going to be a migration back into the core, but cores themselves are going to expand.
I think everybody will have a place that they live that's 40 square feet. The intensity is amazing, and I think that the real trend that I'm seeing is what used to be private space is getting smaller and smaller, and public space is getting bigger and bigger. So I think about, like, my grandmother might have had like a living room with plastic covers on it that was never used. That's gone. And instead, in buildings, there's shared barbecues and all sorts of amenities. And then in the public realm, there's lots of parks instead of backyards and front yards. So we're really looking at saying each person should have the stuff that they use a lot. Let's make it small and beautiful. And then let's take this collective space and really enhance it. That includes a lot of people. Net, you got the best of both worlds. You got fantastic space that you live in, and you got fantastic public space. But the cost of it is much lower on a per person basis because you're not building out all sorts of space that's rarely ever used. So I think that's a massive trend, and we're going to keep seeing more and more of that.
Transit-oriented development is the flavor of the next decades going forward. We're going to see more and more developments being built around transit-oriented hubs. The Smart Track initiative by the city is a logical move to create neighborhoods around these new transit hubs.
I think that one of the most important things is that the cities that are currently winning cities are going to continue to be magnets to attract talent and growth. So that's a terrific trend that we really are seeing here in Canada. I think Canada is a leading country in the world in terms of seeing that happen. It does also raise a lot of challenges, though, for governments in terms of providing infrastructure, whether it's social or physical infrastructure, and for managing some of the social issues that come around growth. So, for example, the provision of affordable housing, make sure that there's social justice and that income and the like are properly distributed over the population as a whole. One of the things that we are seeing in some of the biggest cities around the world is that you can't continuously grow just the downtown. There tends to be more dispersion throughout the city, and so you'll see other nodes of growth. So it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves as Toronto, Vancouver, and the other great cities in this country grow.
I think the difference is we're going to see a lot more multi-use projects, and I think we see that across the country, where you're seeing rental apartment buildings being combined with condominiums, being combined with a hotel, some retail, even some industrial. So the use of sort of those multifaceted projects, I think, are the most interesting. We're seeing that a lot in places like Montreal, and we're going to see that in Toronto too. Of course, it's hard to find good land in Toronto, so I think you're going to need to find a whole bunch of different uses to make a project successful.
There is no question that our world is going more and more and more to urban cores, and as a real estate investor, our whole thesis globally is not on countries, it's on specific cities. We have a city-state mindset because we fundamentally believe that the future of good real estate investment resides in very strategic urban decisions to invest. And if you look at every macro trend in Europe, in the United States, in Canada, you pick your spot, The reality is, urban investment is a function of demographic shifts. It's a function of where cities are headed, and it is a trend that is unstoppable at this point. If you look at infrastructure dollars, whether they're coming from the feds or the province or whatever the weather, they have to prioritize those infrastructure dollars, and they're going to go to cities. The money has to get overwhelmingly to employment zones where it impacts the greatest number of people. So notwithstanding the fact infrastructure would love to go to rural areas and pave every place in this great country of ours, the prioritization of those dollars will get to the places that have the biggest bang for their buck. And so infrastructure is going to come to cities. You know, people want to live and act and play in, you know, cities proper today. The young people, demographic shifts for the older set today. They want to be close to hospitals. They want to be close to amenities. They want to be close to their young families. And so every, you know, belief that I have is that our cities are going to strengthen at the expense of certain rural areas. So that's urbanization. You know, then it dovetails with proper planning. It dovetails with transportation flows and how you manage the transportation flows. It dovetails with good architecture and how you enhance the community as opposed to take away from it. It dovetails with, you know, more inner city problems on how to house people in a you know, world of haves and have-nots, which is a serious city issue. And so the cities get more complicated as the aggregation of the preponderance of development plunks down in these major cities. So it's more complicated, but that's our reality and that's the future, and we've all got to work together within our industry to help solve those problems.
I think what we're seeing with urbanization and intensification has been very, very interesting. And what I mean by that is we tend to talk about it in terms of real estate, but what we're also not talking about it is the requirement for infrastructure. So the interesting thing on the urbanization conversation, people often say, well, it's a real estate play, you know, the affordability of real estate, et cetera. But just think about commuting from a Mississauga or an Oakville for an hour and a half, because our infrastructure hasn't kept up with the urbanization and the intensification strategies. So regardless if you're trying to move within the city, it's difficult, or if you're trying to commute in, it's difficult. So I think the biggest thing that has been missed in the conversation is the real estate got ahead of the infrastructure. And now I think as a city that all one does these days is sit in traffic, I think it's going to be problematic for future growth. I think the planners have got to reevaluate and put infrastructure as a priority, and we've got to look at other means of transportations as we see in Europe for moving large groups of people around in our city.
Going forward, we're just going to see more and more urban intensification in our cities across Canada. So I think you'll see it in all of the, what I'll call the secondary cities in Canada as well, whether that's Edmonton, Calgary, Saskatoon, Regina, Winnipeg. You're going to see it more and more in Halifax. So I think across the country, you're just going to see greater and greater focus on intensification and urbanization.
Well, clearly, you know, the trend, which is very evident in Toronto today, is the combination of all aspects of living in a very central space. So, office, you know, employment, residential, you know, employment, accommodation, and entertainment, all in the same very narrow micro area. And as we go forward, the industry will respond to that by providing ever better solutions for accommodation, employment, and entertainment in very narrow and tight zones.